All right, we'll see how this goes. Putting together a quick review video for you on solving absolute value equations. So what I'm going to do is go through some background pieces on absolute values, look at a couple of equations, review the rules that we had put together back during chapter 4, and hopefully you take notes on this stuff. I'll do an example. I'd like you to pause the video during one of them and work it out and see how you do. And then I have a final example that I want you to do on your own. So just a quick recap. Absolute value is a number that is a distance from 0. So if I am thinking about the absolute value of 4, and I know where the number 4 is on the number line, and I think about how far is it from 0, it is 1, 2, 3, 4 units away from 0. So the absolute value of 4 is 4. Absolute value of -6. All right, here's -6 on the number line. How far away from it is from 0? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the absolute value of -6 is 6. So distance is always a positive value. So when we think about these, what's the absolute value of something that gives us 10? So when you think about that, okay, we know we are at least 10 units away from 0. So what possible numbers could be in here? So in this case, we could have -10 or 10 could be inside the absolute value brackets. For this one, absolute value of something is 7. So we can think about this as either -7 or +7 could be inside that absolute value bracket. But you have been asked to solve equations. So let's look at one of these equations where we have this unknown x. 5 is being added to it. And then it's inside the absolute value brackets. And then finally, it has to equal 8. So we need to think about this as, okay, what could be in here? What values could be inside these absolute value brackets that give us 8? And when we do that, we go, okay, well, if I look at the ones above, I could have -10 or 10 inside the absolute value brackets to give me 10, or -7 and 7 would give me 7. So when I think about this, I could again have 8 or -8. Either one of those are possible being inside that absolute value bracket. So I'm going to pull the question mark away and let's look at what was behind that again. So what could be 8 or -8? Well, this x plus 5 could equal 8, or x plus 5 could equal -8. We have two possibilities for these absolute value equations. So to find what x is, we solve both equations. So here I would subtract 5 from both sides, and I get x equals 3. Subtract 5 from here, and I get x equals -13. So I have my two possible solutions for x. 3 plus 5 gives me 8. Absolute value of 8 is 8. Or -13 plus 5 gives me -8 inside here. Absolute value of -8 is 8. So for each of these absolute value equations, we have the possibility of two answers for an unknown. So now I'm going to go back in time and say, okay, let's quick look at some of the rules that we had. We had 3 steps. We always wanted to isolate the absolute value brackets. That was always the first one. I'd say isolate. Separate it into 2 equations. and then solve both equations. So if I look back at this example, the absolute value brackets were already isolated. I didn't need to do anything there. But I did separate it into two equations. So I had to jump right to step 2, and then I solved both equations. Okay, so on the following examples, I'm going to kind of label this work as I go through it. And hopefully you write this down as well, just kind of keep it fresh in your mind. So here's the first equation. And my steps are isolate, separate, solve. So I need to look at this absolute value brackets and I go, okay, this is not isolated. It's being multiplied by 3 and 5 is being added to it. So just like any equation, I have to start unpacking this. I have to get these absolute value brackets by themselves. So much like if I had 3x plus 5 equals 20, the steps I want to go through when I isolate an unknown, or in this case, isolate the absolute value brackets, I want to move the constants to the other side. That's the first step I want to do. So I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. And I get 3 times the absolute value of x minus 4 equals 15. Now I need to get this absolute value bracket all by itself. And so the last thing that's happening to it is it's being multiplied by 3. So to undo that multiplication, I divide both sides by 3. So I get the absolute value of x minus 4 equals 5. So everything here is step 1. That's where I'm isolating. Now I need to separate this into two equations, either x minus 4 equals 5 or x minus 4 equals negative 5. The stuff inside is equal to 5 or its opposite. And I need to solve both of these now. So that's step 2. I separated that into two equations. And then finally, I need to solve both. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides here on this one. X could be 9. Add 4 to both sides here. And x equals negative 1. So there's my two solutions, and that's my final step there. I isolated the absolute value brackets. I had 2 steps to do this. I had to subtract 5 first, and then I had to divide both sides by 3. And then I separated the absolute value equation into 2 regular equations. I lose the absolute value brackets when I do that. And then I solve each of those equations to give me my possible solutions. So in this case, 9, negative 1. Okay, for this next example, I have 2 times the absolute value of x plus 3 equals 12. What I'd like you to do now is kind of pause the video, go through and solve this, label your 3 steps, isolate, separate, and solve, and get your 2 possible answers. So pause, work the problem, and when you're done, play again and check your work against mine. Okay, so first step is isolate. The absolute value brackets are not by themselves. They're being multiplied right now by 2. So my first step is to divide both sides of this equation by 2. It cancels those out. And now I have the absolute value of x plus 3 equals 6. It's isolated, so that was step 1. Step 2 now is to separate this into 2 equations, either x plus 3 equals 6 or x plus 3 equals negative 6, because that's what could be inside here. I could have negative 6 or positive 6 inside those absolute value brackets. Either one of those values gives me 6. So I need to figure out when that's going to happen. So I subtract 3 from both sides on this one. So x could be 3. Subtract 3 from both sides on this one. And x could be -9. So those are my two possible answers there. So I isolated, I separated it into two equations. Here's one, here's the second one, and then my third step was solve both equations. So that's that: isolate, separate, solve. Okay, so here's where I'm doing each one of these. All right, here's your last example. So to finish off your review notes, I want you to solve this absolute value equation, label the steps, and do this on your own. And so that'd be something that I'm going to check when I see your work that's done. All right, good luck.